Hello everybody, Roger says hey. So I've been told, other than the Battle of Waterloo, this is the video that a lot of you have been waiting for me to get to. I'm honestly really curious about how this campaign in Russia of Napoleon's is going to play out. I know I have to be very careful about making comparisons with Hitler and his invasion of Russia. I know they're not the same thing. I know Napoleon isn't Hitler, but still, after watching the Eastern Front videos of World War II, I am curious to see if there are any similarities with this one. But before we get into watching the video, I do want to kind of revisit just a handful of your comments from the previous video and have a little discussion about that. If you want to skip that and just go right to the reaction, you can click on the reaction chapter in this video and go straight there. But let's first have a little discussion about some stuff in the previous video. Our first comment is from New Heathen, and he kind of answered several of my questions in one comment. In the last video, I did bring up how much I was kind of liking Wellington, and I was actually surprised to learn that he was the brother of the other Wellesley guy. Forgot what his name was, but a lot of you let me know that his real name is Arthur Wellesley, and he was appointed the Duke of Wellington and eventually became the Prime Minister, although he wasn't really considered that great of a Prime Minister. But still, he sounds like a really good general. I also asked what a Marshal was compared to a general, and also a lot of you let me know that the Marshal was like the highest rank you could possibly get in the military or the army. I actually didn't even know that there were different rank structures that militaries could follow. You know, here in the US, we don't have marshals over here, so to me, the term marshal is kind of a foreign concept. I actually did some research on this, and I wanted to know why is it that the US chose not to use the marshal system. Turns out that there were a couple of reasons for it, but the first was that at the time when they were needing to kind of come up with that sort of rank, the guy in charge was George C. Marshall, and so it would have just been weird for him to be Marshal. So instead, the Congress came up with General of the Army. But there was one time in history where the US did have a field marshal, and that was Douglas MacArthur in 1936. When he was over in the Philippines, they actually appointed him as field marshal of the army, and he even wore like a marshal's uniform and had the official marshal baton. But that was quickly done away with in favor of just the title general, and I guess a 5-star general would be the equivalent of a marshal. You know, America has this thing where they don't really want to copy the Europeans too much with things, but yet we still have like a ton of British and European influence here in this country, so it's kind of a weird juxtaposition. But apparently there were higher ups in the military that didn't want to copy like the British terms for things. I don't know. It doesn't really make sense, but you know, that's what they went with. So our next comment comes from Jesus Garcia de Vega, and he says, I'm from Salamanca. Wellington's victory is celebrated here with a reenactment of the battle. So that's actually pretty cool that you guys have a reenactment of the battle over there. Do you guys do that like annually, like once a year? It's actually kind of cool that these battle reenactments are worldwide. Of course, we have them here in the US, mostly having to do with the Civil War, although I think there are some like Revolutionary War reenactors as well. But I have heard a lot of you from the UK tell me that you have a lot of reenactments there of things, and now we're seeing some in Spain, so I guess this is kind of like a worldwide thing, or at least maybe like a European and American thing. I think it would be a lot of fun actually to kind of look more into that. I find it really fascinating, kind of the Civil War reenactors here and just how authentic they are about things. So that might be a fun little subject to get into in future videos. Marco Sebastian Mezzolania, let me know that the Spanish that the narrator in these videos was using is Castilian Spanish, which is very different from the American Spanish that we have over here. Some of the pronunciations are different. So Valencia, for instance, would be pronounced Valencia using the Castilian Spanish. Although I had a couple of comments from people who actually lived in Spain, and they were like, yeah, no, we pronounce it as Valencia too. So I don't know. And saying Freudian let me know that the Scottish Highland regiments were part of the backbone of the British Army. And of course, when I think about it, British does include several different countries. It's not just England, so I do get that. But I think Americans have always just viewed the British Army as back in the Revolutionary days, and we have always associated that with England, which is obviously not very accurate. But a lot of you brought up the Black Watch as being part of the Scottish regiments. This is something that I would like to look more into and learn more about. But the other day I was watching a parade that had some American military soldiers in it, and there was like a block of soldiers that had the kilts on as well, which I actually didn't know existed in the American military. So I don't know what that was about. I don't know if they just have like these bagpipe bands and they just wear kilts because is like a Scottish thing, or if there are like actual regiments in the American military where they will wear kilts, at least for ceremonial purposes. I can't believe that that would be allowed on the battlefield, but I don't know. Like, I'm really confused right now about what's going on. Okay, so I think that generally covered most of my questions. Thanks again for letting me know about all of this stuff down in the comments. It definitely gives me more like tangents to go off and research. I do learn a lot from your comments, so make sure you keep them up. But for now, we are going to dive into Russia. We're going to look at Napoleon's 1812 campaign there and see how it goes. Obviously, I know that he isn't successful ultimately, but again, I don't know all of the details about how it actually goes down. So looking forward to this. And also coming up in the next probably 2 or 3 videos, I'm going to do a video on the War of 1812 here in the US, because I think that correlates with where we are in the Napoleonic Wars right now. So I would like to learn more about that in the context of what we're learning about over in Europe. Obviously, we learned about the War of 1812 in school here. It's just I don't really remember very much about it. So anyway, let's get into Russia. One must never ask for from fortune than she can grant.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered. And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history.
Really? Okay.
In 1807, following his defeat of the Russian army at Friedland, Napoleon had traveled to Tilsit to meet the Russian Emperor Alexander. During their celebrated encounter, the two emperors formed a friendship and made an alliance. But it was not to last. Over the next 5 years, relations between France and Russia cooled dramatically. The Russians were irritated by Napoleon's creation of a Duchy of Warsaw in Poland, which they regarded as meddling in their own front yard. They feared it would lead to the return of a fully fledged Polish state.
Is duchy something? I mean, is that an actual thing? Duchy of Warsaw? So what is a duchy, or is that just the name of it? It sounds like it's an actual thing, but I don't know what it is.
Of Warsaw in Poland, which they regarded as meddling in their own front yard. They feared it would lead to the return of a fully fledged Polish state, a traditional thorn in Russia's side. Then there was Napoleon's offer to marry Alexander's sister, Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna, to cement their alliance. But the Romanovs hated the idea, and after a year of Russian prevarication, Napoleon married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, instead. Later that year, Napoleon broke a guarantee made at Tilsit and annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, ruled by Alexander's sister's father-in-law.
The duchy again. Is that like just an area of land or something? That's kind of what I'm getting from this, or some sort of, not kingdom, but you know, like some sort of rule, I guess, over a certain body of land or people. This is the first time I'm hearing this term, so.
Worst of all was the fallout over the continental system, Napoleon's not very effective economic blockade against Britain, designed to cripple his most steadfast enemy. Alexander had agreed to join the continental system at Tilsit. But it was hugely unpopular in Russia and ruinous to her finances during a period of economic crisis.
Okay.
When
So it's
Napoleon found
economics.
out that Russia was flouting the rules of the system and had resumed an illicit trade with Britain, he was furious.
Okay, well, how is Russia or Britain getting ships through there then? Because wouldn't the blockade block off those really narrow channels right there that the British are going through, so I would think that it would be difficult to do that. So either Napoleon wasn't guarding that little channel right there, or the British, basically, their navy was too strong for Napoleon to hold off, and so they just kind of overtook him at that point. But yeah, that's pretty hilarious, actually, that they just went on trading as if, like, it was no problem.
With both emperors accusing the other of bad faith, their two countries began preparing for war.
Okay, at Tilsit, Russia swore an eternal alliance with France. Now she breaks her oaths. Does she believe us degenerate? Are we no longer the soldiers of Austerlitz? Napoleon's bulletin to the Grand Army.
Napoleon knew an invasion of Russia was a massive undertaking, especially as he still had an unfinished war in Spain that was tying down more than 200,000 troops. Nevertheless,
I mean, this right here just is vibes of the Eastern Front, or World War II, because Hitler also had the Western Front going at the same time as the Eastern Front, so there's that parallel.
Nevertheless, in 1811, he began to assemble the largest army Europe had ever seen, around 600,000 men, though less than half of them were French.
Yeah.
The rest came from Allied states across Europe. There was a Polish corps from the Duchy of Warsaw, led by Prince Poniatowski, a corps from each of the German kingdoms of Saxony, Westphalia, and Bavaria, from the Kingdom of Italy, as well as Swiss, Dutch, Croat, Spanish, and Portuguese units scattered throughout the army.
Now this right here, I can see how this would make it much harder to defeat Russia because you're having to integrate foreign troops into your army. So the training is not going to be the same. You're not all going to be on the same page. I would imagine that this is a bit of a nightmare to try and administrate and command. So right here, it looks like Napoleon is at a major disadvantage to the Russians because he's having to work with such a diverse army that's not used to working together. That would be my assumption of this. So that's hurdle number one that he has to overcome.
There were even contingents from Prussia and Austria, France's recent enemies, now uneasy allies. Some of these Allied troops, such as the Poles and Germans, were as reliable as their French counterparts. Others were very inexperienced, or, like the Prussians and Austrians, reluctant to be there at all. This gigantic formation was deployed in 3 armies. The main force under Napoleon himself, another led by his stepson, Eugene, and a third led by his younger brother, Jerome, King of Westphalia. Neither of these two were experienced commanders. Though one would distinguish himself on campaign, the other would not. On their left flank, Marshal MacDonald led 10th Corps with a large Prussian contingent, while the right flank was guarded by General Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps. Another 100,000 troops were in reserve, including Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. Initially, the Russians only had 220,000 men to face this juggernaut.
I was about to say Russia's army probably will eventually dwarf this. If World War II is anything to go on, Russia's going to come up with a huge army somehow here.
Organized into Barclay de Tolly's 1st Army, Prince Bagration's 2nd Army, and General Tomasov's 3rd Army. They would be outnumbered 2 to 1. But in the run-up to war, Russia scored 2 crucial diplomatic triumphs. Sweden had been at war with Russia just 3 years earlier, a conflict which cost her Finland. By a curious turn of events, Sweden was now ruled by Napoleon's ex-marshal Bernadotte. But after Napoleon occupied Swedish Pomerania...
I heard the Bernadotte there. I know a lot. I was mispronouncing that and saying Bernadette because for some reason that's what it sounded like in the other videos, but I clearly heard Bernadotte there, so yeah, I'm dumb. I'm dumb.
Yeah, without warning, a furious Bernadotte promised Russia that Sweden would remain neutral. Meanwhile, a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire ended Russia's 6-year war against its southern rival. These two agreements secured Russia's flanks from any strategic threat and freed up troops to face Napoleon's invasion.
We're about to embark on the greatest and most difficult enterprise I've ever attempted, but what has been begun must be carried through.
On the 24th of June 1812, French troops began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The army was so large, the crossing took 5 days.
Looks like they're coming in from Prussia then, right?
Napoleon's plan was to attack north of the impassable Pripet marshes and defeat Barclay's army, while Jerome pinned Bagration in place. French forces would then swing south to trap Bagration. Napoleon expected the campaign to be over in 5 weeks. But the sheer size of the French army convinced the cautious Barclay that retreat was his only option. Prince Bagration, a much more aggressive commander by instinct, and often Barclay's fierce critic, was forced to agree. As they withdrew, they burned villages and crops, part of a scorched earth strategy to deny supplies to the enemy. In 4 days, Napoleon had reached Vilnius, but Barclay was gone. To the south, Jerome failed to pin down Bagration. So when Davout's First Corps swung southeast to trap him, he'd already withdrawn to safety. Napoleon's younger brother was out of his depth, stung by the Emperor's criticism, humiliated when his troops were put under Marshal Davout's command. He resigned his post and returned to Westphalia. The campaign was already beginning to expose serious flaws in Napoleon's plan. Knowing his troops would struggle to live off the land in this impoverished region, he'd organized huge supply depots and transport units to feed the army. But wagons rolled slowly along Russia's bad roads, which were turned to rivers of mud by summer thunderstorms. The army had to make frequent stops to allow its supplies to catch up. Bad news for Napoleon's plan to catch the Russians, but
I was thinking about this when they said that they did like a scorched earth campaign and basically destroyed ways to get supplies for the Russians, I guess. But I was kind of thinking, well, if you're gonna just take all of this stuff anyway, wouldn't you want those supplies and food and stuff for your own army? Like, why not just try to live off the land, you know, as you go? That might make things a little bit easier, you know, and now he's in this situation, so.
Catch up. Bad news for Napoleon's plan to catch the Russians, but a much-needed relief for the many thousands of young conscripts in his army, not used to hard marches day after day. Many were soon dropping out with exhaustion. Others deserted. There were also huge problems of command and control over a vast multinational army that was 3 times bigger than any Napoleon had commanded before. La Grande Armée, once famed for its speed of maneuver, had become a lumbering beast.
Just try to take
After
on
a
too
pause
much.
to rest and regroup at Vilnius, Napoleon resumed his advance. Barclay continued his retreat to Vitebsk, where he hoped Bagration's Second Army would be able to join him. But Davout blocked Bagration's path at Sultanovka, forcing him to make for Smolensk instead. At Vitebsk, Napoleon clashed with Barclay's rearguard, but once more the Russians escaped, after setting fire to all the stores they couldn't take with them.
So basically, this just looks like the Russians are retreating at this point. Like, there's some skirmishes, but not any, like, real battles here, is what I'm getting from this. Maybe there are some battles going on here that he's just kind of skipping over. I don't know. But it looks like the Russians' strategy right now is just to not be taken by the French army. It's just to keep retreating and live to fight for another day, basically.
Meanwhile, 300 miles away, on Napoleon's southern flank, Russian Third Army attacked and defeated the Saxon 7th Corps, forcing Napoleon to divert Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps to their aid. By the end of July, Napoleon had advanced 250 miles into Russia, much further than he'd planned. and the long marches in extreme summer heat continued to take a heavy toll on his men. Without fighting a major battle, the army had already suffered 20% casualties.
Wow.
From exhaustion and illness, particularly typhus and dysentery. The army had entered Russia with 250,000 horses, but they were now dying at a rate of 1,000 every day, from exhaustion and lack of fodder.
You guys know how much, look, I know it's dumb to be so compassionate about animals when there are human beings dying. It's just the innocence of the animals that make it seem worse. I don't know. I mean, the whole thing is just a mess, right? I do know, I've seen enough military videos to know that a lot of the problem with military, it seems like most of the military deaths tend to come from disease and health issues, basically, rather than just, you know, getting killed in battle. So obviously Napoleon is dealing with that here. Yeah, it just sounds like a miserable time. Now, I'd be curious to know, I think, you know, it seems like modern day militaries, you know, you obviously get a lot of vaccinations and healthcare in modern militaries. So do you guys still have the same problem with disease and stuff like that? Because I just feel like that wouldn't be as much of a problem today, that most deaths in the military are from actual battle, for instance. So I'd just be interested to know if that has changed at all in like the last few decades or the last century.
At a rate of 1,000 every day, from exhaustion and lack of fodder. It wasn't just cavalry horses that were dying, but the very horses that were supposed to haul the army's transport wagons, making a bad situation worse. This crisis in horsepower came just as the French light cavalry, Napoleon's eyes and ears, met their match in Russia's Cossacks.
If Napoleon had Cossacks in his army, he would have been Emperor of China long ago. What?
Cossacks, self-reliant, proud, ruthless, and superb horsemen, didn't play by the same rules as other European cavalry. Every day they shadowed Napoleon's army, swooping in whenever they saw an easy target, but melting away into the forests if they were attacked by a stronger force.
It's more like guerrilla warfare, kind of.
Cossacks, as well as Russian partisans, made hit-and-run attacks on French supply lines and depots, forcing Napoleon to divert thousands of troops to their defense. Alongside Russian regular light cavalry, they also prevented French patrols from carrying out reconnaissance, which meant that Napoleon often lacked good information about roads or the enemy's whereabouts. Napoleon stayed 16 days at Vitebsk, resting his troops and considering his options. Among his many mounting concerns was the security of his long, exposed flanks. But at Vitebsk, he received news that Schwarzenberg had defeated the Russians at Gorodezhna. A week later at Polotsk, a French Bavarian force fought Wittgenstein's Russian First Corps to a standstill. Napoleon's flanks were secure, for now. Although his main force had been reduced to less than half its original strength, Napoleon decided to push on to Smolensk and try to force the Russians into a decisive battle for the city.
So a lot of men to
Barclay
lose.
was indeed under pressure to give battle from fellow commander Prince Bagration and Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg. The army's morale and Russia's honor required it, they told him. With the First and Second Russian armies finally linking up near Smolensk, Barclay decided to attack Napoleon's army, which he believed was concentrated around Rudnya. The offensive was led by General Platov's Cossacks, who surprised a French cavalry division at Inkova. But alarmed by false reports that Eugene's Fourth Corps was outflanking him to the north, Barclay called off the attack. Napoleon, reassured that Barclay's offensive posed no real threat, began a grand outflanking move to the south to take Smolensk and cut off the Russian retreat. The so-called Smolensk maneuver was Napoleon at his best, using Murat's cavalry to screen his movements and keep Barclay in the dark. The Emperor reached the Dnieper on the evening of the 13th of August. His engineers quickly threw up 4 pontoon bridges, and by dawn the next day, his army was across. Marshal Davout led a second column across the river at Orsha. But a single Russian division, the 27th, fought a heroic fighting retreat from Krasny, delaying the French advance and buying time for Bagration to reinforce the Smolensk garrison. The chance for a surprise assault on the city was lost. And as the Russian army began to pull back, Napoleon displayed an uncharacteristic lack of urgency, even halting the army for a parade to mark his 43rd birthday.
So how is this Napoleon at his best? I mean, nothing he's done here has worked really, so don't really get that.
When the main attack on Smolensk began 2 days later, Napoleon opted for a frontal assault. 150 French guns battered the city as 3 French corps attacked its medieval fortifications. The Russians resisted bravely, but Barclay, fearing encirclement, ordered another retreat. With Smolensk in flames, the Russians began to pull out. Just as the French fought their way into the city, to scenes of utter devastation. Bagration's Second Army withdrew first. As Barclay's army followed, its rearguard was caught by Ney's Third Corps at Valutino. General Junot, commanding the Westphalian 8th Corps, had orders to cut off Barclay's retreat. But having crossed the river, he did nothing, and the opportunity was lost. A furious Napoleon swore that Junot would never now win his marshal's baton.
So why did he just stop and not do anything there? That's kind of weird. Also, I guess maybe Napoleon did actually win this, so maybe it is him at his best. Guess it just needed to give it a little bit more time.
The Battle of Smolensk cost both sides around 10,000 casualties and destroyed one of Russia's most historic and holy cities, but settled nothing.
Before a month is out, we'll be in Moscow. In 6 weeks, we shall have peace. Get a little cocky
After
here,
the missed
Napoleon.
chance to defeat the Russians at Smolensk, Napoleon paused once more to consider his options. His men were weary and far from home, and it was already late in the campaigning season. He considered sitting out the Russian winter at Smolensk and resuming the campaign in 1813. But now he was just 230 miles from Moscow. A century earlier, Peter the Great had moved Russia's capital to St. Petersburg. But Moscow remained its historic and spiritual heart, a prize for which the Russians had to fight. Napoleon, always a gambler, decided to push on. The Russians faced their own dilemma. Emperor Alexander had experienced a kind of religious epiphany that summer and rallied the Russian people to the country's defense, describing the war with Napoleon as a war to save Holy Mother Russia from the Antichrist.
Okay.
For months, the emperor had received conflicting advice to stand and fight or retreat. Now he decided change was needed. The cautious General Barclay kept his job, but the emperor summoned General Mikhail Kutuzov to take overall command of Russia's armies. Kutuzov had been beaten by Napoleon at Austerlitz 7 years before, but he'd since won several victories against the Ottoman Empire and was a true Russian, loved by the troops. Although Kutuzov agreed with Barclay's strategy of delay, he saw that constant retreats were destroying the soldiers' and the nation's morale.
I was gonna say.
If Moscow was given up without a battle, the fallout could be disastrous. And so, 70 miles west of the city, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army prepared to make a stand. Europe was about to witness the bloodiest day's fighting of the Napoleonic Wars.
Really? Wow. Okay. Well, it looks like Borodino is the next one up. So obviously there are a lot of really famous military things happening here that I've never heard about in my life. But then again, I've never really studied military history specifically, except for the US military history. So I guess I probably wouldn't have heard this stuff before. But I'm really glad that I'm learning about it now and getting clued into a lot of these really major historical events that have taken place in human history. I don't know, Roger, what do you think? See, he's enjoying it. So again, like I said, I don't know what's going to happen here, but it does look like that Napoleon is overextending himself, not only because he's got the two different fronts going on, but he's really asking a lot of his soldiers. Seems like he's getting a little bit too big for his britches. He's getting impatient, and instead of like moving back and pacing himself in a more smart way, he's just kind of forcing things, and you know, I know it doesn't end up going his way in the end, but I'm also expecting the Russians to come up with a bigger army for some reason. I don't know why. It just seems like maybe I'm just thinking too much in parallel with World War II, where the Russians built up like a huge army of just millions and millions of soldiers. Obviously this is much earlier in history, so they probably don't do that, but I mean, I think Napoleon does take Moscow, but then he gets pushed out. So I'm just kind of thinking like the only way that happens is if like an overwhelming army does that. So, but I could be completely mistaken. We'll find out, I guess, over the next few videos. It looks like there are going to be several videos on Russia here. But if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you like and subscribe. We're going to have the other videos coming up here pretty shortly, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And Roger and I will see you next time.